In the previous video, you learned how to create a Lambda function using Eclipse. In this video, we are going to deploy and test our function. First, we will set up our Eclipse IDE with AWS credentials so that we can access AWS from within Eclipse. Then we will deploy and run our Lambda function from within Eclipse. And last but not least, we will take a look at the Lambda function on our AWS Management Console. I'm back inside my Eclipse IDE, and the first thing that we need to check before we can upload and run our Lambda function is if Eclipse has access credentials to access AWS. So I'll open the preferences, and here you can see on the left-hand side there is an item for AWS Toolkit, and here it is set up with my default AWS profile, with my access key ID and my secret access key. If you have set up an AWS credentials file on your local file system, Eclipse will take the information from that file, otherwise you need to enter it here. Please go back to the install and setup guide if this has not been set up for your Eclipse IDE. Okay. Now, let's deploy our Lambda function. I go on the demo project folder and click on Amazon Web Services, and here you can see that there are three different options. I can deploy my project, I can run a function, or I can upload the function to Lambda. The first thing that we need to do is upload our function to Lambda. And here is a wizard that guides us through the steps that we need to do. First, we need to select a region where we want to deploy our Lambda function. I select the EU Central region in Frankfurt. And as a name, I select my Java function. Let's click on Next. And here are some more configurations, such as the IAM role. You can use the Lambda basic execution role, or you can create a new role here. You can also select a bucket where you want to store the function code, so the Java class files and dependencies. And here you can also select how much memory you want to give the Lambda function. I go with the default settings and click on Finish. This will upload the code to the S3 bucket. And now it's creating the new Lambda function. And now we are done. Now the Lambda function has been uploaded. We will take a look at the AWS Management Console in a moment, but now let's run it. AWS Web Services and run function on AWS Lambda. We can also enter some input and invoke the function. Now let's invoke the Lambda function, right-click, Amazon Web Services, and run function on AWS Lambda. Here we enter a JSON input for our function. And invoke our function. Now let's run our Lambda function. Right-click on the demo folder, Amazon Web Services, and run function on Lambda. And here we can enter an input for our function. So the function that we have created expects a string as input. So let's just give it a string and click on Invoke. What you can see here is that our function output is Hello World. I'm now on the AWS Lambda dashboard on the AWS Management Console. And as you can see, the My Java function, Lambda function, has been added using Java 8 as runtime. If I click on the function, I can see some more information like configuration details, triggers, and monitoring data, and I have invoked it once, so that's what I'm seeing here. I can also see the logs by clicking on View Logs in CloudWatch. And here I can see that there is a new log stream for my Lambda function, and it tells me input random string, which was what I was logging out on the console. And here I can see the logs of my Lambda function, and indeed I can see input random string, which was the string that I invoked my Lambda function with. I'm back in the Eclipse IDE. Before we finish this video, maybe let's access the context object and return some of the runtime information of our Lambda function. So, for example, we could return the remaining time in milliseconds. This is an integer, so let's make it into a string. And now we run our function again, and since our code has changed, it must first upload the new function code to my Java function. Now the function has been invoked, and as you can see, the remaining time in milliseconds is 14,000 something milliseconds. So our default configuration of the Lambda function is 15 seconds. In the next video, we are going to build a slightly more complex Lambda function that takes an S3 event as input. See you there.